Hi, welcome to tranScrip Talks. So in this podcast series, we'll be attempting to address some of the challenges that pharma and biotech companies face in taking good science and transforming that into medicines that drive real value, most importantly for healthcare professionals and patients. Now, I'm Rob Fox. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at tranScrip, and I'm delighted today to say I'm joined by Dr. Chris Floyd. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Rob.
Chris is our Executive Medical Director for Early Development. And Chris, obviously you're one of our resident experts on clinical pharmacology, translational medicine and early development, but perhaps you could give a little bit more insight into your background and your kind of career path that's led you to tranScrip today.
Yeah, no, of course, Rob. So my background, so I'm a UK physician, or physician scientist probably to be more accurate, with certification in clinical pharmacology and general internal medicine. And what's always motivated me in my career is trying to apply the relative certainty of science to the complexity and uncertainty of human disease, and specifically how we can try and predict how patients respond to certain types of drug therapies. And I was a physician scientist, clinical academic for around 15 years before I joined industry. And to give a bit of a flavour of kind of the things I was doing to try and address that sort of underlying theme, my PhD was in precision medicine, looking at biomarkers of aspirin resistance. I did various experimental challenge models in healthy human participants to see what happened when we tried to modulate blood pressure with environmental or dietary measures. I was a phase 1 investigator at the Guy's phase 1 site, and also did various bits of mathematical modelling to try and predict the economic and the clinical benefits of certain therapies. And what I realised whilst I was doing that is actually it's very challenging to do that within an academic environment, and the realisation that the science was nowhere near as certain as I thought it was, and the complexity was even higher. So I thought to actually try and go ahead and make a meaningful difference in patients, I should get closer and be a more active part of the drug development process. And to that end, I initially joined GSK, where I spent 4 very happy years within discovery medicine, looking at target ID through to phase 2, working across neuroscience, respiratory, cardiovascular, nephrology, and a few others, to name but a few. And then after that, I moved to tranScrip at the beginning of this year. And the reason for moving to tranScrip was really to try and do what I'd been doing in big pharma, but for smaller biotech clients and the challenges that come with that. So currently I work with biotech clients from everything from target ID through to market authorization applications, but really with a focus in that early development space and seeing how can we get an idea or a molecule into the clinic and eventually to benefit patients.
Well, Chris, thanks. That's really a broad level of experience. We're certainly excited to have you here at tranScrip. And for this podcast specifically, we want to focus on some of the challenges that pharma clients really face in terms of moving from that preclinical phase into first in human work and then beyond. So maybe we start right at the very beginning, and I'll ask you to sort of define what is early development.
So for me, it is the archetypical bench to bedside. How do we take a hypothesis and develop a new medicine? And part of that is thinking, okay, we have a scientific hypothesis at the beginning that very often is based on some observational human data. How do we then move through the phases going from that observational human data into cellular systems, into animal models, and then ultimately into often healthy volunteers and then into patients? And as part of that, what we have to do is we have to weave this narrative or golden translational thread that runs through the whole conversation, the whole piece, so that actually at each stage we are building on the evidence package and better understanding how our drug might impact the target and ultimately impact the disease.
So, Chris, you mentioned the stages there, but does early development apply to one specific phase or multiple?
So if you would take the most restrictive definition, you'd probably say it starts round about candidate selection and then runs through to proof of concept, so the end of phase 2. However, I think actually the skills that we use in early development are applicable much broader than that. So we can go right to the start of drug discovery, thinking about our target identification strategy, because if we don't know the problem we're trying to solve, how do we do our target identification to try and solve that problem? And then equally, we can stretch it all the way through to market authorization application and beyond. because a lot of kind of the early development type activities we undertake often happen in parallel to later development. So I'm specifically thinking about clinical pharmacology studies like food effect studies, drug-drug interactions, cardiac safety, that often might occur later in the program than what you classically class as early development.
Yeah.
And the other key thing I'd just add is that we often start a development plan with one indication in mind. We might be in phase 3 for chronic kidney disease and actually decide this could be a great medicine for COPD, respiratory condition, in which case we almost go back to the start, or not the start, but some way earlier in the pathway and start looking at that indication as well. So data flows in all directions, and I think you need that early development mindset at all stages of your drug development pathway.
Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of that broad application across the life cycle. Perhaps an obvious question, but why is it so crucial to get it right in your view?
Really, it's the foundation of what we do. If you don't get your early development strategy right, it's like building a house on sand. Bad things are going to happen. And that's because the early development plan will set things out like your early safety profile. You get an idea in animals to then justify then going into humans later. It will help set out your target product profile or target medicine profile. What are you trying to achieve with this medicine in this disease? And to give an example of how decisions early on can snowball and have adverse consequences later on, I'll give you an example of let's say, producing the right amount of drug for your preclinical toxicology. If you don't produce the right amount of drug for your preclinical toxicology, you can't then do the toxicology experiments you want. So let's say you miss out on your top dose. You're then limited on your top dose in your phase 1 because you haven't demonstrated it in animals in the usual way. And then you go to phase 2 and you're not taking a high enough dose and your phase 2 fails. And that phase 2 hasn't necessarily failed because you had the wrong drug or the wrong target or the wrong patient population. You just haven't dosed high enough because 8 years ago you made 800 grams, not 1,000 grams of your drug product. And that is why it's so crucial to make those right decisions. And the thing I'd add to that is that in many ways there are no right decisions. You just need to weigh up all the evidence that's available to you and come up with the best guess really of what you need with appropriate amount of overage in the case of CMC development.
Yeah, and I guess therefore, given how crucial it is, a company looking to move into their first in human work, what would you say are some of the key principles they should have top of mind really when they do that?
So I think the two key things are what do you need to actually get into your first time in human, but then what do you need to move from your first time in human into your next study? So first time in human phase 1 historically used to be safety, tolerability, and PK. And in order to generate the data package to get into that, there's almost a tick list of things that you need to do. And by and large, that is what do you need to populate your investigator brochure. So preclinical toxicology, pharmacology, safety pharmacology, animal PK, CMC type stuff. It's not a surprise what you need to be able to dose your first patients. Where the challenge then comes, though, is actually saying, okay, what else can we generate in that first time in human study that, again, builds on that translational narrative, that golden thread I was talking about earlier, which enables us to then say, yes, we've got great confidence. Well, maybe not great, but we've got enough confidence to justify the investment to then do that larger, more expensive phase 2 package. And I think within that phase 1, it's really helpful to say, we've identified particular biomarkers preclinically. We're going to measure them in phase 1. You then measure them and say, look, we said we'd do it. We've done it. This is now what we can do in phase 2 to, again, build that narrative and increase that confidence. And all of those things combined with a clear medicine vision, I think really are important before you even start dosing your first patient.
And given the tone that you're sort of setting there, how important is it to have those, I guess, early regulatory interactions as you go through that phase?
So important. The regulators, on one hand, they are the gatekeepers. Regulators and ethics committees, the ones who can say, no, you can't do this. but we should never really view them as some sort of hurdle that needs to be overcome or some enemy that needs to be defeated. The regulators are very much a partner in this process. And so the earlier we go and talk to them, the earlier we can get feedback on challenging components, because most drug development is challenging. There's not an A to B to C to D type route for every medicine. Most medicines have got things that are slightly outside the ordinary. And so when you go for that early regulatory interaction, you'll commonly ask about your CMC manufacturing, you'll ask about your preclinical toxicology package, but you'll also hopefully be able to come with an idea about what you want to achieve in your first time in human study. And especially things around how you want that study to be adaptive are really important. And to give a couple of examples of that, increasingly we're looking at monoclonal antibodies with extended PK, so you can reduce the dosing frequency is one advantage of those. Now, if you don't know how long the drug is going to last in humans, it's very hard to develop a study. So you need to add that flexibility into your design. And similarly with, say, oligonucleotides, whilst the PK is quite short, actually how long those drugs produce a pharmacodynamic effect is often not known. And the last thing you want to do is to go back and pause a study and have to pause recruitment and make lots of changes that take time when it's documented changes, substantial amendments, for example, rather than actually have that adaptability built into your study.
Yeah. And as you know, Chris, a lot of companies out there, and certainly a lot we deal with here at tranScrip, they have multiple therapy areas they're dealing with in their pipeline. Would the approach change there, or would it remain consistent across those therapy areas?
So the principles largely remain the same.
Right.
The one therapeutic area that's always been a bit of an outlier, I guess, is oncology, where you need a slightly different preclinical package, and your ability to dose in phase 1, you tend to dose up to the maximal tolerated dose historically, rather than some lower level. But recently it's been recognized that actually that approach means that a lot of patients receiving oncology medicines are potentially receiving right at the top of that dose response curve, where they've got maximal efficacy, possibly some doses ago, and actually they're now in that toxicological window. And so it's interesting, Project Optimus from the FDA has been around for a while now, and they're essentially saying that you need to have a better translational package in terms of those biomarkers you can measure through. So again, talking about that narrative, you want to be able to weave that narrative based on biomarkers from your preclinical to your clinical. And I think there's a lot of benefit potentially there to get oncology patients the same level of benefit, but without the toxicology and toxicity that we currently see.
Yeah.
The one other thing I'd say about oncology that is also really interesting, I mentioned about protocol adaptability. So oncology, more than any other therapeutic area, has that adaptability in their phase 1 protocols. So they may add in combination therapies, they may expand their cohorts, they may expand to different diseases, they may change their dosing frequency. And so if you don't have those early conversations and you just present the regulator at the point you're ready to go with this very complex protocol, you haven't really given the opportunity for that dialogue. And that obviously impacts timelines, which isn't great. And if you're a small biotech, more than anything, time is money. And actually, you don't want to be burning through your cash supply when you're waiting to get study approval.
So it's clearly, as we've established, it's extremely crucial to get it right. It sounds very complex. So what are some of the common mistakes you've seen companies make when they're moving from that preclinical into the clinical phase?
So I think the hardest one is not moving. So decision paralysis is a real thing in science, where you always think one more experiment will give me the answer I'm looking for. And that could be the answer to go, or that could be the answer to stop. And I think companies being able to make those decisions earlier can be much more nimble. And I think that's one of the big challenges, not making a decision. The other thing is in terms of kind of the phase 1 plan about how much data do you collect and how much do you measure. And I mentioned that phase 1s are no longer just safety, tolerability, and PK. You need to get some measure of pharmacology and build that translational narrative. but equally, you don't necessarily want to throw the kitchen sink at it. Technology has come on so much over the last couple of decades that you can measure tens of thousands of things from a couple of milliliters of blood. But if you don't know what you're going to do with that data, and you don't have a hypothesis that's based on that data, you suddenly can be in a whole heap of trouble if you are trying to make that story post hoc. So it's sort of the Goldilocks thing. You don't want too much, too little. You want just the right amount of data. And the other thing I would say is that the perfect phase 1 protocol, and this applies to all phases actually, so the perfect clinical protocol is not the perfect scientific protocol. It's the one that gets done where you can recruit the patients and you can do it within a reasonable time frame. And so there's always an element of compromise and pragmatism when developing these things. And I think there's again a bit of decision paralysis, always looking to see how can we make that protocol 5%, 2%, 1% better, when actually good enough is sometimes good enough.
Good. You've mentioned already a few things that are kind of vital to help the success of the early development. Beyond data, beyond the regulatory interactions and the sort of operational aspects and considerations, what else is vital as a component to ensure better success from that preclinical to the clinical phase?
So team is hugely important. Getting the right people, and not only is it about getting the right people with the right expertise. For example, if you're doing early development, get an early development physician. Don't get a late stage medical affairs physician. If you're doing late stage medical affairs, do the opposite. But it's also how that team interacts. I think it's important that you don't end up in biotech building teams where you have a central CSO and then you have a load of consultants who are kind of spokes to the wheel with the CSO in the middle. Everyone, I think, needs to be talking to each other so they can buy in on the right strategy and the right tactics. Because ultimately, if people are not aligned on the direction you want to go to, any path will do. And the trouble is, as I've said, with my CMC example earlier, if you take any path, you suddenly get bound by decisions you took earlier, or worse, decisions you didn't take. In medical ethics, we would often talk about the acts and omissions doctrine, whereby there was no moral difference between making a decision to do something versus making a decision to not do something. Slightly different in pharma, but equally, if you choose to do something or you choose not to do something, I think it's the same in terms of that accountability. And I think it's really important to make decisions, be accountable for those decisions. And obviously, if the evidence changes, you change your decision. But you have to make the decisions and you have to have the team set up in a way that those decisions can be as well informed as possible. Yeah,
right. Doing nothing is a decision in its own right. So
Absolutely. And the other thing I'd maybe add is indication prioritization.
Right.
So it's very tempting to go after the biggest indication or the indication that maybe has got the best scientific rationale behind it as your first intent. But actually, it might be that related indications, either clinically or biologically, might be the best approach to take. And within that, you kind of bring in the commercial side of things, not just the clinical tractability, but the commercial side of things, whereby historically you wouldn't launch let's say $1,000 a month medicine before you launched your $100,000 a month medicine. Now, things are going to change a bit with the IRA and how that works in the US, but that's perhaps something for commercial colleagues to talk about at another time.
And Chris, how would they do this, companies, in a way that also sets them up for future development, past the first in human work? How would they address that in the right way?
So for me, and I'm a slightly biased here, I think the pinnacle of early development is the clinical development plan. Ask commercial folk and they might say it's something completely different and we're just a base of that pyramid. But in early clinical development, your CMC, your toxicology, your animal PK, et cetera, ultimately informs how you design your clinical development plan. And so building that with flexibility in mind in terms of responding to emerging data, change in not necessarily strategy, but tactics for those different indications I mentioned, that is hugely, hugely important. The other thing is those interactions with the external environment. So I've already mentioned how we should view regulators as partners, but also we can expand that out to key opinion leaders, to patient groups, to market access experts, to payers. Because if you try and develop a medicine as an island without input from all of these key stakeholders, you could end up not being in the right place when you come to put in your market application authorization or potentially later. And the final point I'd say is, again, I mentioned commercial a lot at the moment, but commercial viability of your medicine. The best drug is not the one with the highest binding affinity, it's the one that the patient receives. And plenty of very, very good molecules have fallen by the way because the commercial proposition from early on hasn't been set up in the way that it should be to optimize that medicine and that opportunity.
And Chris, I have to ask you, given your background and your skill set, how important and what is the role of the early development physician in this process?
So very, very important.
Yeah.
Obviously, Rob. So early development physicians have I guess they contribute two main aspects. One I would say, are clear deliverables. So we will typically design the clinical development plan, have a lot of input into the target medicine profile or target product profile. We will be involved in the translational medicine strategy from preclinical to clinical and beyond, and that overall medicine vision, because we have a reasonable idea of what the patient needs and what physicians want at the end of all of this. The other side of things is I think early development physicians are very well placed to be part of that core leadership group with the CSO and with other key team members. And the reason is that we've got a very comprehensive, I think, understanding of that end-to-end drug development process that other functions who may be a little more siloed do not necessarily have. And so we can give that overarching view on how we should be progressing to get to that first time in human and beyond.
Yeah, sounds like an important role then. So
the most important role.
Okay, and then maybe just finishing up, I'd be keen to hear your views on any trends or factors you're seeing in the industry now that are really influencing now or in the next few years early clinical development.
So I think any question about the future, one always has to mention AI these days. And I speak about it not as an AI expert, but someone who is starting to integrate it into my daily work. And I guess on one side, AI has been fantastic in terms of revolutionizing target discovery. And obviously there are a lot of companies set up that specifically do that. The ability to analyze and process vast amounts of data, make inferences about biological processes that aren't previously understood, and generate hypotheses is really unmatched in this day and age. The other side of things where I think it's very valuable is in processing existing published materials. So when I was doing my PhD, I spent many, many months probably now, which seems a bit archaic, writing systematic reviews and meta-analyses, going through all the primary sources and working out what data we wanted to extract and understanding the value or relative value of those data sources. These days, I could probably spend an hour designing a prompt and come up with the same output in a couple of minutes. And whilst that is absolutely fantastic, it does worry me for two reasons. One is that suddenly at everyone's fingertips, there's a huge wealth of information, and actually whether people will have the training to analyze that information so that the access to information is no longer the barrier. It's now what you do with it and how you understand it. And part of that is that as we get more and more AI generated content, do we end up in this infinite loop of garbage that is a real risk? Moving away from AI then, I guess the other thing that I thought was really interesting this year was the FDA's declaration to try and move away from preclinical animal testing, initially with monoclonals and then maybe biologics. And if they're very optimistic, maybe small molecules, but it's going to be challenging, I think, to do that. That's going to be really exciting to look at. I didn't see any real roadmap on how they want companies to do it, but rather to go and have that conversation as a willing partner. My interest will be whether we move from a expensive, time-consuming process we understand to an expensive, time-consuming process we don't understand.
Yeah.
But we'll have to watch this space and see what happens over the next few years.
Well, Chris, I think that nod to the future, it's a good point to draw the podcast to a close. So, I mean, I thank you so much for your time. You've given us a lot to think about. I think it's clear from what you've said, there's a lot of moving parts in this process, and it's really important you've got a strategy that can kind of link into emerging data both internally and externally. It's also clear that really you do need a strategic plan that can be adapted based on the potential, because decisions you make early can really dictate the future potential of the medicine. So it not only needs to fit in with plan A, but potentially plans B and C as well. And also what really came through was the fact that you need to make the right decisions at the right time. And I think to do that, you need the right team and you need the right members in that team. So a lot to think about. So thank you very much for your insights today.
Pleasure.
That draws the podcast to a close. So we'd say if you've got any questions for me, or most likely for Chris, you can get hold of us through the website or through LinkedIn. And please stay tuned in the future for future podcasts. So thank you. Goodbye.